Welcome to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisin, the host of Inside Personal Growth, and joining us from the other side of the country is Kris Girrell. You say it. I want to make sure I'm saying it right.
Girrell, that's correct.
Right?
Yep,
Girrell.
yep, perfect. Yeah.
And it's Learning to Feel. The subtitle is One Man's Path to Reconnecting to the Heart of Emotions. For those of you who want to learn more about Kris, I would encourage you to go to Innerworks, INNERWORKS consulting.com. He also has a podcast show that will be up there as well, so you can take a look at that. And Kris is going to be speaking with us this morning about this new book. He has quite a few other books too, and I would encourage you to go to his website and check out his prior books. Even though they don't follow a path toward this one, all of them, there is a similarity.
It is the path of my life, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Path of all of our lives, which is twisting and turning and going here and there.
So true.
But Kris's background spans 40 years of organizational consulting, executive leadership coaching. He's a sought-after speaker. He's the author of 7 books, which you can learn out that go from marital relations to spiritual and personal transformation. He's a strategic consultant. He's worked in elite Boston business landscape, pharmaceutical companies, legal, financial firms across all the United States, South America, Europe, and Africa. Globally recognized leadership coach in the C-suite, lifelong competitor in rugby, taekwondo, and 4 Boston marathons. His background from an educational standpoint is a Bachelor of Science and Masters of Education in Psychology and Counseling from Pennsylvania State University, and he took courses toward a doctorate at the University of Maryland. He received and completed his Master's of Arts in Theology Research at Andover Newton Theological School in Boston, and he's certified in a large number of psychological and behavioral assessments, and is a member of the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists and National Speakers Association. Well, you have an impressive background and bio, and as you said, I think in the book a couple times, if it came to psychology, maybe you're a little bit overeducated. But there's nothing wrong with that, Kris. That's good. You know, in this book, as I saw it, was you being quite vulnerable as a writer, as a human being, talking about your own personal stories, and allowing that vulnerability to actually be the journey and framework for the book to let people get in touch with their emotions. And I think you did a really good job of that. And I want to start this off with the first question, which is really, and you start the book off, you were quite vulnerable about this. It's a time when Sarah, your wife, confronted you about some flirtatious emails you were sending to an old flame. You then speak about doing deep work and your emotions about not being enough. And I want to pause there for a second, because that's a big thing that drives people to take actions both positively and negatively. Meaning, you know, not being enough.
Not enough. Yeah,
you could actually end up being an alcoholic or a drug addict. Not being enough can be a driver to send you to the top of CEO of a company.
Right.
So the whole concept of just not enough means, hey, maybe this woman isn't good. I could go get another woman and have an affair, and that's another thing you could address, right?
Which is certainly one of her interpretations, yes.
Yes. So speak with us that as it relates to getting in touch with that emotion.
Well, so let me just unpack that just a little bit. Starting off with that level of vulnerability, was a risk that I've taken. All of my books before have been subject matter that I'm an expert on, and so I could write about it. But there's this thing that stuck in the back of my head, and we talked about it earlier when we were just having a conversation, where Ken Wilber's good friend David Data called him a fraud because he said that Wilber's job was to be at the cutting edge of the human experience and report back. And anytime he wasn't doing that when he was teaching or when he was writing, it was fraudulent, and essentially my wife is calling me out as a fraud because I teach emotional intelligence. I teach, I know all about it, emotions, and I could, talk at length about them, but did I actually experience them? And do I know what my experience is? And in this one particular incident that came up where my answer to her is, I don't know why I did that. It was back in the days when social media was just coming to the forefront, and people were just connecting, with people, and this old flame had contacted me and said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And it just escalated really rapidly, and and they cut it off.
She wanted to know what you were hiding.
She wanted, yeah. Well, I didn't hide it. I mean,
I know.
I was naive. I am naive a lot of times about internet stuff, and so when she was looking for something on my computer, she actually came across the text to my men's team where I said, "Hey, I cut it off right at the root," and I just wanted to be honest with my team. And she said, "Cut what off?" And starts looking and says, "Oh my God, there's this trail back and forth between me and this other woman." And she said, "Why did you do that?" And my answer was, "I don't know." And that was unacceptable. So I went on this quest to really dig into what is it that causes our emotions. What was the emotion that was driving me? Because a lot of our actions, a lot of what we do are not actions, they're reactions. And what we're reacting to is often a visceral feeling, a gut emotional feeling, that causes us to do one thing or another. So I went on this quest to do that. And, a buddy of mine who's a consultant and an author as well, said, you really ought to write this. This is a good story. So it was a real risk for me to tell the story of how I went digging in the dirt to find what was the source of that.
Interesting. You talk about emotional intelligence, and obviously you're very well versed in this topic, but yet you went back to school and got a degree in theology. Mm-hmm. I'd really like to know what your definition of spiritual intelligence is.
What a brilliant concept, So emotional intelligence, and I'll relate the two, emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, things like that, is the ability to be aware enough of yourself to know what's yours and what's not yours, so that when I'm reacting to someone else, I'm not blaming that other person for my reaction. I know that came from me. I know what the source of my emotions are. And the important part of emotional intelligence is getting to what's the source code underneath it, because our emotions come from our beliefs and our thoughts about those beliefs. So if I have a belief I'm not enough, my emotion about being scared or feeling fragile or needing to compete, you listed my competition stuff, that's all from not enough. I'm just trying to prove to myself that I am enough, right? Nobody plays rugby for that long.
where, Kris, would you find truth? So in other words, if we have a belief, and beliefs can change based upon
experience based on our experiences. Yeah.
So, but when most people get involved with religion, we're going to have questions about that coming up. By the way.
Yeah, right.
They get a big T. I call it the big T of truth.
The big truth. Yeah,
and they stand on
that.
They stand on that platform, as if nothing else in the world existed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can people not be so aware that they find themselves in that big T, and then they find out that that big T is a lie? And I'm not going to say
Right.
that about, I'm not going to point out any
No, no, no,
religion.
no. I hear
I'm
what
just
you're
going to say
asking.
what it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so let's reel it back. Where we learn those big T truths is when we're children. You
Mm-hmm.
know, a lot of us get our spirituality, a lot of us get our beliefs about higher power or the divine or whatever you want to name that which is greater than ourselves when we're kids. You know, we either got
Mm-hmm.
it from our parents, or we got it in Sunday school, we got it whatever, you know, at yeshiva, you know, however, whatever spirituality that you grew up in, somewhere in that you were taught those things. And as children, we learn things in absolutes. You know, in developmental psychology, we talk about the first phase of development is fundamental dualism. Yes, no,
Mm-hmm.
good, bad, up, down, black, white, you know? And so those things are taught to us as this is the way it is. And we often never, you know, and religions don't do a good job of this, of freeing up the person's mind, teasing them to question. You know, most religions teach doctrine and that is unquestionable. You know, like it is what it is, you know, the undeniable truth of the Bible or something like that. And
Yeah.
if you haven't studied that subject or haven't gone into it, it still lives as a truth. But what
Right.
happens to us along the way is that we have experiences. You know, my book on the dark night of the soul is called Wrestling the Angel. And it's about what happens when those big T truths get blown up. You know, we have a belief that God is good and protects little children, and suddenly we see a bunch of children in a school massacred by some idiot with an AR-15. And we
Right.
go like, how could God allow that to happen?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so suddenly that belief in a deity that makes good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people gets blown up. It can't live in that place. And so some people, like, you know, you have one of three reactions. One is you retreat to fundamental dualism. Two, you know, you just give it up, you let go.
Right. Right.
Three is you evolve, you know, and what happens in the dark
And
night of the soul is that,
hopefully
yeah,
when people read your book, they're going to evolve, because this
well,
is a
we
book.
hope.
Well, but this book is about evolution,
It is, yes,
evolution on a
yeah,
journey.
yeah.
And I want to say something. You know, you mentioned in the book that you believe that the emotions are emotions.
Hmm.
And I would say this even for myself many times. I'm not, look, I've been doing this show almost 17 plus years now,
Wow, yeah.
and I've heard it all.
Mm.
But you say our emotions are hogtied in the trunk. I love that term. I love that term that you used.
Well,
And we're
actually, it's
not,
the other way around. I want to correct that. You know,
what was it?
it's actually that emotions are in the driver's seat and reason and logic are hogtied in the trunk.
Okay, I got it wrong then.
Yeah, right. And it's
But
actually from Brené Brown. I lifted that from her, and I thought it was such a great way to describe it.
it
That,
is.
you know, and what she means really, and what I mean by that is that emotions often drive our reactions. You know,
Right.
and they override our logic and our willfulness, our mind, if you will. Those more gut level reactions that are emotional reactions really, you know, take us down a street that we don't necessarily want to go down. You know, if we were thinking logically about it, if we're making rational decisions and things like that.
I
So,
often say today, when I see what's going on in the world, you know, where did
mm,
logical reasoning go? Where did deductive
yeah.
reasoning go? You know, is it, you know, and this next story that we're going to talk about with you
Mm,
is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because it's our perception of reality. Now, here's
hmm.
what happened that you described in the book. You lived in Germany or on a military base, your family were playing with a bunch of kids with toys, and
Yeah,
they
I was
wouldn't
about
allow
4 years
you.
old then.
Right.
Yeah.
They wouldn't. Well, I mean, like Bruce Lipton says, the first 7 years are plugged in, and
Yep.
literally, you're not going to erase those 7 years, right?
Right.
So, so you're playing with these kids, and then they mock you for being stingy because you're not
Right.
allowing them to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Then you
And
recall the story for our listeners, and subsequently, now this is the
what happened
part.
to it? Yeah.
This is the part that people have to get here.
Yeah.
It's about the story, it's about the toys, but it's about what you made up as your
Yeah.
reality as a kid at that point, which just shows you where people potentially can go when they want to make shit up.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
And so the brain's job is to make meaning. Right. The
Uh-huh.
brain's job is always making shit up. Right.
Hmm. Right.
And so here's this little kid. I'm, 4 years old. I'm playing out there. The kids start teasing me. I get pissed. I get angry. As angry as a little 4-year-old boy could get. And I look down, and there's a set of stairs that, like just 3 or 4 stairs that go down. They're made out of bricks. And there's a loose brick on the side. And I picked up that brick and I threw it, and I hit a kid on the side of the head, and it just gushed blood. And, I got scared. I ran inside, hid under the dining room or the kitchen table, crying, and I wouldn't come out. So that's what was in my head as the memory. And I'm doing, much later in life, and when I'm like 35 or 40 or something like that. So it's quite a while ago, but I'm doing this training, and they challenge us to question our fundamental beliefs about ourselves. And this memory came up. And so my sister's 2 years older than me. And so I call up my sister and I say, la da 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 da, tell the story about that and throwing the brick and hitting the kid. And she said, well, I remember you hiding under the kitchen table crying and not coming out. I don't remember anything about the, hitting other kids or anything. Maybe you should call mom. So I called my mother. She goes, Kris, this is an army base. The mothers are all hardwired together. If anything like that even remotely happened, I would have known in an instant. That never happened.
Yeah.
And my mind went kaboom, and so suddenly what I recognized was that this 4-year-old little boy got angry enough to want to throw a brick. 4 years old, I don't have the physical acumen to be able to pick up a brick and throw it and hit you actually in the head.
Yeah.
It probably would have gone plop in front of me. But in my mind, I visualized that, and it was so clear a memory that it lived as a reality for me. And suddenly my belief about me being a big, hurtful person got blown up.
Yeah.
It just, like I lived for 35 years believing that I could cause harm. I'm 6'3",
Well,
220, I'm a big guy.
but that is what we're talking about is
right, exactly.
How these stories evolve and then live inside of our consciousness, right? And we believe them, and then you validate it through other people that it wasn't true. It's almost like doing a Gestalt therapy, right? But you didn't go you didn't go into the other little boy's head and pretend like you were him. You didn't need to. All you really needed to do is check with mom, and mom said, hey, Kris, there's no way you threw a brick or hit a kid in the head.
Exactly.
If you did, the whole army base would have been.
I would have had some other kind of consequence other than crying under the table.
I think you and I talked a little bit before we started this podcast, and one of the things I think is important is, they always say in mindfulness and meditation practices, take a deep breath before you act, not react. And this is around our emotions playing in decision-making process, right? I think this holds true whether you're buying a car, buying a house, or you're choosing a mate, right? It's a decision you're making. Sometimes these are very lifelong decisions, can be very expensive. Emotions, let's face it, when it's love, you said you made 2 t-shirts. One was love 3, and the other one I'm wearing, which is gratitude. Right? So speak with us, because this is a really powerful concept. And I'm going to relate one thing real quick. There's an MIT grad, and she's blind, and she's written these books about choices,
Hmm.
how we make choices. Now, you probably already know this, but she went in and studied, and I think she's written 2 or 3 books. She's been on the show. Fascinating woman. About, hey, when you have 5 choices at the grocery store and you're trying to make a decision versus 3 choices versus 2 choices,
Hmm.
right? And now you have this myriad of choices about making a decision, right? And
Yeah.
how the mind works. The more choices you have,
Hmm.
the worse decision you actually make.
Yeah.
Proven logically, right?
Yeah. Right.
So how do you help us deal with these emotions which are driving our ability to make a decision, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent?
So I have to inhale because there's so much to unpack in that. So first off, much of our decision making is not choice. Much of our decision making is emotional driven reactions, and a lot of those reactions, or a lot of those what we think of our choices, are neural paths that we've been down so many times that it's habituated. And so we tend to always go this way when we get to that juncture in the synaptic pathway. We always go right, or we always go left, or whatever. And so we have a lot of those automatic choices. What in the research that was done at Harvard was Barry Schwartz ran, and it's called The Paradox of Choice, is his book. But and she actually accurately represented that when we have too many choices, one, we get overwhelmed and we don't choose.
That's right.
Two, we tend to second guess ourselves, our choices, when we have multiple choices. If there's only 2 choices, you're going to pick one, and you'll be happier with that one because you picked it, because the other one was clearly off the books, off the table. But when we have 10, or let's say in the choice of a mate, and there are 1.5 million young women on the internet who are exposing various parts of their body in seductive ways, some guys look at that and say, wow, compared to what I have here, that looks pretty attractive. And so their choice making is blurred because they have too many alternatives. What Barry Schwartz says, it's like when he gives people a chance to renegotiate their choice, they have less satisfaction with their choice and more often second guess themselves. If they're not able to renegotiate their choice, they have greater satisfaction. They report they like their choice so much more. So when you choose to get married, for example, when you choose to have a car, buy a car, that buyer's remorse that you have afterwards comes from those multiple choices out there, unless you say, no, this is my choice. Now, how do we get to a decision where we're actually making choice, not reaction?
Well,
That's what.
how do you prevent analysis paralysis? And
it-
then
it-
people don't make
yeah,
any choice. So
right,
there's three
exactly.
choices,
Well,
and they analyze so much that they end up going, well, I'm just not going to do it at all.
oh yeah, and the original study that that woman was talking about, they literally went to a Whole Foods market in
Right,
Cambridge, and
right,
they put out 10 different jellies, you
right.
know,
That's the
it,
same woman
exactly.
I'm talking about. And the
Yeah,
peanut
right.
butter.
And the
Yeah,
peanut, right. And when people had too many choices, they never used the coupon, they never bought the jelly or the peanut butter.
right.
When they had only 3 choices, same store, same population, different time. When they had only 3 choices, 70% of the people bought one of the jellies or bought one of the peanut butters.
Mhm.
3% when they had 10.
Right, right,
3%
right.
versus 70%. So that overwhelm, and what Schwartz calls the paradox of choice, you really don't have a choice there. You're not making a choice, it's overwhelm. And so you get into this, analysis paralysis. So how we have to get to decision making, and my very first book was written about decision making, was a textbook way back in the 70s. Um, but what we have to look at is not what the alternatives are. what we have to look at is, what is it that I want? What is it that I need out of this decision right now? And so what eliminates the analysis paralysis is knowing clearly what it is that I'm trying to do for myself, or what I'm trying to do with this decision. So I just bought a new car, and I wanted something blah 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 blah. And I listed out my desired outcomes, and I saw 3 cars that fit those criteria. And I looked at the, consumer report ratings and things like that. And I checked off all the boxes. And the one that satisfied the greatest number of highest weighted desired outcomes was the one that I bought. I don't have buyer's remorse, because for me, that choice met all the things that I needed. Had I looked at, I'm looking at a RAV4 versus a Subaru Forester versus one of the other Kias, and if I was looking at Kia versus Subaru versus Toyota, then I'm confused out there. Those 3 choices, and they, it's apples and oranges. They're different creatures. And so my mind would bounce back.
How are we dealing with inherent biases? Because the reality is, well, look.
You do have bias.
You make this choice. Everybody on the internet is trying to create a bias toward whatever it is they're selling, right? Whether it's a Toyota or a Kia, doesn't matter.
Right.
When you're picking a mate, say, well, I like blonde hair, blue eyes. Oh no, but there's a redhead over there. She looks pretty good as well, right? Or he. I mean, I don't want to be biased here on sexes.
Right.
Sexes. Explain, because over time, as we evolve and become older, I see myself today having biases towards certain things that I maybe didn't have as strong a bias toward previously.
And we also have to be conscious. We also have to be conscious of what we call confirmation bias, which is, I have a belief that Toyotas are better than Fords, or I have a belief that blondes are dumb. And sorry, blondes, but my wife is a blonde, but she's not dumb. But I have a belief that this is better than that, or whatever. And so I look for evidence that will confirm that. And so a lot of our choice making is confirmation bias driven, not real choice.
Okay.
And again, the whole process of learning to feel is to try to get at the base code of what are my beliefs that are driving all this, not the emotional level.
I think that's the most important thing you've said, is to get to that level of awareness.
Yeah, that's what emotional intelligence is.
When we're just riding on our emotions, and we're not questioning and being aware of the decision we're making, we fundamentally can make some very wrong decisions. Right.
Well, let's go back. I want to go back. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Greg, but I don't want to step over this. You used the term spiritual intelligence.
I asked you what your definition was of it.
And so I want to answer that. I want to answer that. So if emotional intelligence is being aware of your own experience, your own belief system, that's the result of those experiences, and trusting that, so that you're making choices based on what is there, not the emotion that it's causing. Spiritual intelligence is trusting the spiritual experience that you've had. So my spiritual experience is something other than the big T truth that my church had taught me, and what overrides that previously held truth is I trust my experience. If I've had, a spiritual experience, if I've had an experience of, kind of touching the divine, whatever that is to you, then I get to trust that more than what I've been taught.
And I will say this, that every podcast, I wrote a book called Hacking the Gap: From Intuition to Innovation and Beyond. Now, this was my own way to look at a bigger spiritual world. Every major business person, from Warren Buffett to Bill Gates, will tell you that their intuition was their best decision-making element. Okay.
Right.
Now, you can go look them up on the internet. There's quote
Yeah.
after quote after quote about
Sure.
intuition.
Mm-hmm.
But intuition, now this is a fascination. Your fascination and curiosity about things that are greater than ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
especially religion. You wouldn't have gone back and gotten a degree in theology if you hadn't had huge curiosity. You mentioned that the Bible was rich with lessons, but rife with juicy stories. And if you would, speak with us about how this shaped emotion about guilt and shame for you. Because now here's two emotions.
Well,
You
yeah.
grew up in a fundamental background, let's face it. All right.
Mm-hmm.
You're not there now because I can see from the symbols and signs on your door in the back of your room that I see more of an Eastern bent direction that you've taken versus Catholicism.
Well, I never was a Catholic, so
or
don't blame
whatever
me
you
for that.
were
Right.
in.
I grew up Lutheran. Yeah.
Lutheran. Okay, so
Yeah.
Lutheran. Sorry, but they're
No
not
problem.
they're not that
They're
far.
not that far apart. Yeah, right. They're cousins. So how did the Bible and stories of the Bible? So I have, like I said, I've been fascinated with religion and spirituality since I was a little kid. It's probably the same age as the brick incident. I've still been fascinated by that stuff. There's something in me that was always curious about that. And I actually, after my undergraduate, I went to seminary to become a minister, but dropped out after a semester and a half. I just, wasn't ready. But I've always, I've read the Bible, I don't know how many times. And as a young kid, and certainly as a teenager, there are stories of, in Joshua, there's a story of a guy traveling to a foreign city with his concubine, and he gets to the city, and he's granted sanctuary by his host, but the concubine was left outside. The men of the town came and said, let your friend out there, because he's not one of us. Let us have our way with him. They didn't, but they left the concubine out there. They literally brutally raped her all night long and left her dead on the doorstep. Now, that's in the Bible. That's a story in the Bible. And there are people who want to say everything in the Bible is God speaking. No, it's actually people just telling stories. And the story they were telling there was brutal sexuality. It was not a pretty story at all. And yet, as a teenage boy reading that, we all went tee hee hee. So here it is that we're taught, believe the Bible, it's the word of God and things like that. And yet in there's these stories of, read, Song of Solomon, just so erotic literature, beautiful stuff, but, it's pretty erotic, talking about woman's breasts and, blah, 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 little testosterone fueled teenage boys studying that stuff really had fun with it. And yet we were told it was wrong. So how do you have something that's right and something that's wrong? That really messes with your brain. Like, how can it be right and wrong at the same time? In dualism, that doesn't exist. So, things like that actually cause us to progress in our development. So we move from dualism to multiplicity to et cetera, all the way down the pike. But it played into a lot of guilt and shame because the church was telling me that sex is bad. Lutherans are very stoic, we don't have pads on the pews in Lutheran churches because sitting on hardwood is more painful and therefore, a better lesson about what, like this is, like
we're not going to give you any damn cushion to sit on.
No, right. Because life is hard and God is tough and, all that kind of stuff. So Lutheranism had its own stuff.
That's the strong Swedes that, where that Lutheranism came from,
exactly.
Is your background Swedish?
Girrell is actually Danish.
Danish. Well, but it's Norwegian. Let's just call it Norwegian.
It's Scandinavian. Right?
Yeah. That's where it comes from. But look, you say in the book that teachings of the masters, most of the masters, all of the masters, are founded in non-duality. That's you're just talking about.
Right.
Much has been written about this concept, but not everybody listening today gets the concept of non-duality. You said it
Yeah.
earlier, black, white, good, bad,
Hmm.
that kind of thing. Uh, can you address how the teachings influenced your emotions? You started
Hmm.
and your early childhood and your studies from the Bible. You just told that story, that great
Hmm.
story. Um, but
Great.
literally, now let's fast forward to the Kris of today.
Hmm.
How has those teachings, the influence, and your journey in theology
Hmm.
really defined who Kris is today, fundamentally about his beliefs and how he carries his emotions?
That marries together a lot of what we've been talking about so far. So first off, throughout all of this time, I have experience. My life experience. By the time we reach late teens, we're pretty certain that life experience is teaching us more than what we learned in the school. When we teach adult learning theory, we teach that you ask questions instead of tell answers. Because when you're telling people who are adult learners, they already have so much experience that telling doesn't register anymore. So you ask them what they know, and then you fill in the gaps. Well, through that journey of spirituality and theology, my fundamental question throughout my youth and young adulthood and even in today is, why do people believe what they believe? And how do they get those beliefs, and how does that compare with what I believe?
Mm-hmm.
um, so my journey has been one of starting to trust my experience as my spiritual experience as the truth that I live by. And you ask, why do the masters always teach non-duality? Because those truths don't live as big T capital truths anymore. They
Mm-hmm.
are my truth and your truth. And so when we get to a place of non-duality, when we see that there is no right and wrong, but that I choose this as my path and you choose that as your path, then I have a great wide highway of room for you and anybody else's belief. What if I believe that whatever divinity is truly almighty,
Mm-hmm.
all powerful? Then I must also believe that entity, that experience could show up in just exactly the way that Greg Voisin needs it to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows up exactly the way Kris Girrell needs it to show up. And exactly the way the fundamental jihadist needs it to show up. And suddenly I realized that there's no right and wrong in here. There's just what that person's experience is. And so I can relate to another person. The fundamental problem we're facing in this divisiveness in our world today is that we don't have room for the other person in our discussion.
Exactly.
And when you get to non-dualism,
You
then
do have
there
room.
you have room.
Right.
You
And I want
say,
to I want to tell our listeners in the time remaining, Kris,
oh yeah,
because it's been a really engaging. We could probably do three
we could
hours
go
of
for
this.
hours, I know.
But this book right here, the
Yeah.
table, right? It leads me kind of to this. I know the listeners can't see it that well, but
Yeah,
buy the
right.
book just for this. Okay. And the reason is scientifically, Kris has broken down all the emotions of passion, depression, into this periodic table, including
So,
all of the positive emotions, bliss, uh, humility, pride, grace, all of them into a periodic table, which is really quite
right.
fascinating,
Yeah.
actually. And for those of you who can't see, I'm wearing gratitude right now, and he had one on earlier that was love. He the here's my
So,
point to
so
this.
yeah, let me just do the backstory to that very quickly.
Okay.
All right. So it's not a research scientific thing. It's actually something I did because I was was hired to teach emotional intelligence to a bunch of scientific researchers, the director of R&D at a pharmaceutical firm. They were all PhD MDs, brilliant off the charts, but had no emotional intelligence whatsoever. And I needed a way to open the conversation, to get them to at least say, emotions are important, and that, recognizing that somebody who is frustrated is not the same as treated the same as somebody who's angry. Those are different emotions, though similar in looks. So I used the Mendeleev chart, the layout of the old chemistry chart that we all learned in high school. I used that as a format, and then I put in the emotions, but I did them in a way so that the pure emotions, like the noble gases, were at the top, the heavy emotions and the unstable ones were down in the radioactive area of the lanthanide and actinide series. I had periodicity across from visceral emotions to more heady emotions. And so there was a way for him to see it, in relationship and in periodic, levels. And then I tossed in a whole bunch of puns, so a lot of the emotion names, the symbol I gave them are puns. Like relief is listed as RX, like a prescription,
Right.
pleasure is MM, and things like that.
Right.
And then I also gave them atomic weight. So if you stand up and show your gratitude, the atomic weight for gratitude is 24.7.
There. I can't get it that high.
You can't get it
But
high
but it's there. But
24.7 because, gratitude is something you practice all the time, 24/7. Love has the atomic weight of 3.14 pi because love makes the world go round. So I put in all these little jokes like that, which, these guys, once they saw there were jokes, they started looking for them.
Right.
And once they started looking for them, they were engaged in the conversation. I could start talking to them about emotions. So that's kind of the backstory to it.
Well, but regardless of it being a backstory, I think if somebody was to take the chart and just pin it, I always say, if somebody took a video camera and watched you during the day, would you like who you were?
Yeah.
Right. And
great question.
And this book, just that chart alone, no matter what the price of the book is, to get the chart is actually worth it, because as much as you say, well, I did this for a bunch of scientists, everybody at their own mind they have a degree of logic. They want to look at these emotions. They want to try and better understand it, which kind of leads me to my wrap up question here, because we are all trying to better understand how these emotions affect us in many different ways. And we know that they do affect you physiologically. We know that you can raise your cortisol levels by having high degrees of anger. We know that you can cause things to happen in your body as a result of too much overflow of adrenaline as a result of something. Oxytocin, we know, is that love kind of chemical, that euphoric one. So there's a cool total relationship here, physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, to all of these emotions. And that leads me to this.
And our behavior,
And our behavior.
Yeah.
You did a great job in pulling all this together in one book and being personally vulnerable with your stories. The reader learns a lot. What are 3 big takeaways you want to leave the listeners with today about the book and about Kris and his journey and what he's learned about emotional intelligence?
Oh, great. 3 points. So point number 1 is there is no good emotion, no bad emotion. All emotions are great. There are uncomfortable emotions that we don't want to feel, and we might label them as bad, but, then that takes away the ability to do point number 2. The emotions are the doorway into understanding what your beliefs and your thoughts are that cause those emotions. And it's really self-awareness that is at the bottom of emotional intelligence. And we're really trying to get to a place where we can have enough of an emotional vocabulary. When I do workshops, I ask people, write down as many emotion words as you can. And I'll give you 5 minutes. And most people have their pen down in 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And the average number that they write is between 30 and 40 words. And then they say, of all the ones that you've written down, circle the ones that you can say you actually fully experienced that emotion. You know what the average is? 5.
Mm-hmm.
5 emotions that we can name as ours.
Well,
So
because we can identify with the name
right.
related to the emotion.
Well, and there are names, but
most
that we
people
wrote
aren't
on
most people aren't making a periodic chart of emotions.
No, but most people don't have access to the hundreds of different emotional nuances that we have. So, so part of the whole journey is just to get aware of a better emotional vocabulary. And then I think if there's a third point, it's that that you can get yourself to a level of awareness where you are able to make choice as opposed to reaction. So much of our work and so much of our living experience is a reaction experience. And in order to get emotional intelligence and understand and have a better emotional vocabulary, so you can say, oh, that's why I'm doing this, then I'm now putting myself in the place of being able to make choice. I can choose to do the reaction, I can choose that, or I can choose to do something else. And freedom is being able to choose. If we don't have that access to the substrate, we don't have the language that helps us identify the differences between those different feelings, then we're not going to see why we're doing what we're doing, and we're going to go on automatic pilot. And most of our lives are lived on automatic pilot. I want people to walk away from this book with choice. And
if
that's
they
the bottom line.
And if they read the book, or they at least make an awareness, you said that in one of our earlier discussions, create an awareness about all these emotions that we have, even if they can't figure out how to deal with them, they can identify them, right? And I think people will say, well, I can identify anger, and I can identify love, and I can identify this emotion and that emotion. But there's so many more that you need to understand that are occurring subconsciously. So this book is
driving your thank you. And driving your behavior, because it's subconscious. It's unconscious.
Yeah,
it's not even it's unconscious.
Yeah. I mean, I was, my listeners already know this, but I go to a hypnotherapist, and every time I go and we do a session, I literally realize, just how much crap is blocking. They say, what's the difference between your reality and your potential? It's really, right? Here's my reality, and here's the potential. And frequently, you're not accessing the part of your brain which is preventing the potential to be explored. Right. Yeah. And there's so much more potential than there is current reality. And your book is, everybody should get this book. It's easy to read. Look at this. It's not that many pages. Go out and go to Amazon. We'll have a link to that. We'll have a link to Kris's website as well, which is innerworks-consulting.com. He also has a podcast, so you'll be able to access his podcast as well. Kris, it's been a pleasure having this really cool discussion. I want to invite you back for either Wrestling the Angel or Typhoon Honey. So let's work on one of those two if you're open for that.
I would love to, Craig. I mean, I really enjoy our conversations, and we always kind of tend to open up new things, and I love the way you think and ask questions. So it'd be a pleasure to be back and do that again.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember Phil, the psychologist Phil, that they did the Netflix series about. What's his name, Phil? Do you know what I'm talking about?
You mean Dr. Phil?
No.
Oh, no.
His first name is Phil, and they did a documentary about him as a psychologist interviewing a guy, and I'll think of it. I'll put a link in the blog for everybody, so you don't just go crazy thinking I'm nuts. But fascinating And it was how he really interpreted and asked questions. And I hope everybody out there listening thought the questions that I asked Kris today were revealing of some of the things that you needed to learn. And we want to thank you for listening, all my listeners. We appreciate you as much as anything in this process. So, Kris, namaste to you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and
You
we'll
too.
talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Greg. Look forward to it.